It's difficult to think of any other recording artist to date whose career was defined simultaneously by their inconceivable highs and their soul-crushing lows more than Michael Jackson. If you were to ask anyone who was personally associated with Michael to tell you what he was like behind the scenes, I believe the stories you would hear would paint a clear picture of a man who had two very different and conflicting personalities. On one hand, he was the king of pop, a man whose career was so megalodonic in both prestige and capital that making money became less of an objective for Michael Jackson and more of a byproduct of his existence, dying with an estimated net worth of over $500 million in the bank. Not only was he seen as the king of pop, but he also led a lifestyle appropriate to someone who had been given that title. At his peak, Michael Jackson signed with Sony's music label, and on the day that Michael signed that contract, he made more money than Sony makes on average in one day in 2023. And they were the ones paying him. Not only did he have the talent to make it in the industry, but he had the business chops behind the scenes to guarantee that he could make bucket loads of money no matter where he went on the globe. But on the other hand, Michael Jackson was also a deeply neurotic and paranoid man. His well-known and documented drug abuse, on top of his natural disdain for the tabloid media, made him a perfect specimen for the media's wider interest as a whole. An example of this is Michael Jackson's skin. When Michael Jackson's skin began to turn white, the media began to spread the story that he had actually been bleaching his own skin. This claim is at least said to be false by Michael and his estate, as Jackson at one time suffered from a skin condition called vitiligo, a condition that depigments one's skin, leading to blotches of white skin, until the entire body as a whole follows suit. It's impossible to talk about Jackson without also bringing up the accusations of child abuse levelled against him over the years either. Michael would settle out of court first in 1993 by paying $20 million to the family of a young boy by the name of Jordan Chandler, who claimed that Jackson had molested him and other young children. Other accusations would be brought unto Jackson during his career, as others would claim to have been mistreated by him in the past. While he was never found guilty of any of these charges, and in most cases successfully fought the accusations in court, these cases would not only do irreparable damage to his reputation, but also his mental state. In today's video, we'll be looking into one of the situations that saw Michael's mental hang-ups pushed to their extremes, as we take a look at the strange history of his partnership with Sony. Michael Jackson and Sony first crossed paths in the mid to late 80s, when Michael was signed to CBS Records alongside the likes of Ozzy Osbourne and Bob Dylan. While the history of CBS Records is deep and full of name changes and other hard-to-follow business dealings, when Sony purchased them in 1988, the deal was worth $2.2 billion, as most of the artists signed to the label were inherited by Sony. Many fans to this day speculate that Sony bought CBS outright specifically to get to Michael Jackson, and while we'll probably never know if that was the main catalyst behind Sony's business dealings, it does at least make sense when you think about it. Michael was already an established name by this point. It would be almost impossible to swat Michael up with a contract when CBS Records was already a big name themselves. So buy out the whole thing. Sony comes out on top with their own music label that's even bigger than before, with some of the biggest earners in the industry, and pay a meager $2.2 billion for their troubles. Michael would remain under contract with Sony for around a year before they chose to extend his contract in a massive way. To date, this contract is one of the biggest, most beneficial, and most lucrative contracts of all time, with Michael Jackson himself ironically being the only one to break his record later in his life. The contract would guarantee Michael an advance of $5 million every time he released a record, with some also theorizing a potential 25% in royalties, depending on the level of success during the partnership. With that, He was also made a significant person in most of Sony Music's business dealings, as they'd made him a 50% stakeholder in Sony Music, a decision that allowed Michael to run his own record label and make decisions that could have affected Sony in big ways. To put it lightly, Sony had given Michael a ton, arguably more than he was worth, with some industry insiders at the time being against the idea due to things like Michael Jackson's slow release schedule. One analyst and publicist theorized that if Michael was to continue releasing albums in the same way that he'd been doing previously, his last album with Sony would have been released when he was 60 years old. Michael's first major project under the Sony Music banner was his album Dangerous and the accompanying world tour under the Epic Music label, owned by Sony. By the end of the '69 concert tour, Michael had raked in $140 million for the whole set length of the tour, but during the early stages of the proceedings, Michael would be accused by the family of Jordan Chandler of molestation. Being the first major output from Michael under the Sony banner, this is the first example of potential issues brewing between the two parties, as he was met with a difficult choice to make in the aftermath: either settle or fight the claims in court. While it's hard in hindsight to really know what the best choice would have been at the time for Michael, all we know for sure is that Sony's choice would have been to settle, no question. If Jackson was to have fought against the claims in court, he would have had to cancel a considerable leg of the tour, leaving Sony and everyone employed for the tour itself out of the loop and in a bad position. Of course, Sony, being a billion-dollar conglomerate, was more interested in the short-term prospects of the situation, and most likely would have feared that Michael's reputation would have taken a major hit if he had have pulled out so early during their first tour under the label. It's important to note that Michael's attorney Tom Mesereau hoped to actually fight the claims in order to fully exonerate Michael of the crimes he was being accused of. The problem? Everyone on Michael's side was encouraging him to settle as opposed to fight, hoping to get them back on the road so that the tour can continue and pull in the money that Sony was definitely hoping to reap the rewards of after signing Jackson. While Michael Jackson and Sony would continue their partnership for a while after this, to say the relationship was cordial would be completely wrong. Back when Michael signed in the '80s with Sony, the media made a big deal about calling him a reclusive star, as he was really always relatively quiet outside of his act. However, if you look at '80s Michael Jackson in comparison to the Michael Jackson of the late '90s and early 2000s, it's almost like you're looking at a different man entirely. His reputation by that point had become marred by the media's frequent coverage of his personal life. His largely publicized drug issues, which at one point led him to collapse on stage in front of millions, became a large story. His marital issues were on display in tabloid magazines, and, most importantly, the accusations of child sexual misconduct were growing in both numbers and severity. They were even trying to figure out what plastic surgery Michael had done in order to restore his image after his vitiligo diagnosis. Adding all of this on top of an already very paranoid man's psyche was a recipe for disaster. Not only did Michael Jackson despise the media, but he was also growing more and more distant to Sony as well. Michael would begin to worry that Sony was intending to genuinely cause him physical harm, at one point claiming to family and friends that he thought Sony was actually going to have him assassinated. While this might sound crazy to you and I, when you think of the reasons Jackson had to think this, it becomes at least more understandable why he would think so. At this time, he was in possession of some of the most lucrative music catalogues aside from his own, that being the Beatles and Elvis music catalogues, a fact that Jackson took incredibly seriously, as he believed the big corporations would see them as nothing more than a means to make big profit while completely throwing away the artistic content. Over the years, he had also become dissatisfied at Sony and would float around the idea of becoming a free agent or signing with another label. But, as of course he owned 50% of Sony Music as it was, it would become hard to come to an agreement that both parties would be happy with, leading Michael to float around in limbo for a while until anything could be done. These next two issues, however, seem to have completely severed the relationship between the two parties. Firstly was Jackson's issue with one Tommy Mottola. The story between these two starts when Michael was recording his first Sony album, Dangerous. Tommy was the head of Sony Music Entertainment at the time, and he'd managed to place the label within the top 3 recording labels on the entirety of the planet due to his leading chops. And while the two seemed to be on the same page early on in the relationship, it would reportedly turn sour on Michael's end due to Jackson's dislike of the supposedly corrupt business practices he had accused Tommy of publicly. At some point, Michael even accused Tommy of using a racial slur to refer to another black artist signed to the label. While none of these practices have been corroborated by anyone from Sony, people have actively denied that these things had ever actually happened, which leaves us in a strange position as we're going off of one person's word against another. Apparently, Michael at one point hated Tommy so much he actually had him on a shit list of some kind that Michael would be found with upon his death. Most of this bad blood seemed to have boiled at its hottest during the production of Michael Jackson's album, Invincible, the final studio album that Michael would release before his death in 2009, and the main catalyst for the two parties' separation. Due to Jackson not touring with this album, a lot of the weight was on Sony to advertise and promote. After the album's release, however, Sony abruptly cut all of the promotion of the album, leading to the album's long-term success being hindered. While no one really knows what the main and genuine reason for this choice was, some have theorized that the issue has something to do with Mariah Carey of all people. In 1993, the head of Sony, Tommy Mottola, married famous pop star Mariah Carey, a relationship that would last until 1997. The highly publicised divorce of the two would see Mariah's career put in jeopardy, as the man she had just been married to was still the head of one of the biggest music labels on the planet. If Tommy was genuinely the type of person that Michael claimed he was, then it wouldn't be out of the question for Mariah's career to be ruined in such a situation. Of course, we don't really know if any of this is for sure, but hypothetically, it is a possibility. The theory states that Mariah, in her time of need, turned to Michael Jackson for support, and Michael, with his part ownership of the label, made sure her career was safe from higher-up corruption and meddling. At the end of the day, I'm not really sure what is truth or fiction in this story, but if anything, this situation does prove one thing. Michael Jackson really was as reclusive as the media claimed. Had these allegations been levelled from any other star of his magnitude, and it would have been plastered all over the front page media in an instant. But because it was Michael Jackson, someone who refrained from the mainstream media's grasp, the only way I was able to find out anything about this potential lead was by searching on fan sites and forums. Michael would occasionally find himself in Sony's view throughout the next decade, as the two parties would exchange harsh words and begrudgingly do business on occasion. But all of this would come to an end in an unlikely and tragic way. It's hard to look back at Michael Jackson's career in the 80s and 90s in comparison to his life in the mid to late 2000s, just because of the almost inconceivable fall he experienced by that time. By 2006, Michael's life was marred by growing health issues. He had also found himself in considerable debt due to numerous legal problems and financial issues he had found himself in by that time. And by 2009, he had sold off a considerable amount of the Beatles' music catalogue just to get some form of financial stability. He also planned to go back on tour, not out of an interest in continuing his career, but more out of necessity, despite his health.
We're getting some breaking news coming into the situation right now from about Michael Jackson, the king of pop, who's 50 years old. Let's go to Deborah Farrick. She's working the story for us. What are we picking up, Deb?
Well, here's what we can tell you. This is what's being reported by KTLA. Apparently, Michael Jackson suffered cardiac arrest this afternoon. He was rushed
On June the 25th, 2009, Michael Jackson would pass away due to cardiac arrest caused by acute propofol intoxication, a result of a deadly intake of numerous prescription drugs and sedatives. The story of Michael's death was on its own a massive story, a story that saw his former GP, Conrad Murray, charged with involuntary manslaughter. But with only 2 weeks before Michael was planned to go back on tour, the music world was struck as one of the most well-known and seemingly invincible artists of all time had died. I was around 8 years old when it became known that Michael Jackson had died, and while I didn't listen to his music at the time, I remember how big of a deal it was. On one hand, the world was shocked that a man who had been seen as so indestructible in his prime could even die to begin with. He was, to music, what Ronda Rousey was to MMA, what Grand Theft Auto 5 was to video games, and what Breaking Bad was to television. Something that only truly comes around once in most people's lifetime. Something so relevant to the cultural zeitgeist that even if you're not a fan of it, you know exactly what it is. Michael was an individual whose star shines so bright, it was equivalent to the fucking sun. But on the other hand, the conflict of interest that this situation caused was immense. The same media reporting on Michael Jackson's death was the same that perpetuated the narrative that he was a heinous child molester. The Michael Jackson estate would have their own issues with Sony even after his death, proving that death means nothing when money's involved. But I think I'd like to dedicate a specific video to those topics later down the line. They're quite interesting, so at some point I will make that video. But for now, let's end this one off. At the end of the day, it's difficult to really know what side to take on this topic. On one hand, Jackson's statements about greedy record labels wasn't even that unpopular of an opinion, even at the time. Plenty of recording artists and musicians have spoken out about the rampant corruption in the industry, the exploitation, and the unfair levels of greed. Plenty of rising stars have had their careers ruined by meddling on the label's behalf, and if anything, for what it's worth, I believe Michael was being 100% genuine when he made these claims. On the other hand, Sony had given him enough resources to remain the king of pop for decades. To this day, he holds the record for the most lucrative contract of all time, and he was, in life, not only one of the biggest earners in music, but the biggest earner in the whole of the media landscape, bar none. No matter what side of the coin you're on, however, the story of Michael Jackson and Sony proves that even the largest stars can be snuffed by media bias and mental health issues that cause long-lasting effects through their respective industries, even after their death.